displacing 1.5 million people from their homes. It was one of the major natural disasters that this country endured in the 20th century. The governors of 6 states along the Mississippi River petitioned President Coolidge to appoint Hoover to be placed in charge of the flood relief effort. And his work during the flood brought Hoover to the front page of newspapers almost everywhere in the country, and he gained renewed accolades as a humanitarian. Now, he used the relief work, because he was already running for president at the time, to articulate what he thought was a good Republican approach to the relationship, to problem solving, to the relationship of government and the private sector. He stressed that work success was successful when the assistance available was provided primarily by private citizens and private organizations, and the government assisted by, again, providing a coordinating framework, identifying potential donors, taking an inventory of all the donations, and also having a sense of where the various needs were, but not necessarily being the body that then delivered the goods, the food to, say, some parish in Louisiana, but allowing the private sector, in this case mostly voluntary associations or churches, to know where they needed, where things were needed, and if necessary, if they did not have the proper transportation, to then and only then to help them get the stuff delivered. The famous quote was, "I suppose I could have called in the army to help, but why should I when I only had to call upon Main Street?" That is, the everyday people had the capacity to solve all the problems. What they didn't have the capacity to do was to know what all the problems were. That would be the role of government. And so in 1928, when Calvin Coolidge announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election, Hoover became the leading Republican candidate. And he campaigned for efficiency and on the Republican record of prosperity over the past 8 years. He ran against Alfred E. Smith, who was the first Catholic or the first person who wasn't a Protestant to run for president. He was governor of New York and also known as a reformer and a proponent of efficiency, and both candidates were pro-business. And where one of the major areas where they differed was on prohibition. Smith was for its repeal, whereas Hoover gave limited some support to prohibition, calling it an experiment noble in purpose. And we'll get to prohibition in a little bit. Smith won extra support among Catholics in the big cities, and he was the target of intense anti-Catholic bigotry in many Protestant communities. So taking advantage of the intense anti-Catholic sentiment in the South, Hoover appealed to white voters in the South, and he carried 5 southern states. In order to do this, to make this inroad into the solidly Democratic South, he had to make compromises with southern white leaders and assured them that he would not interfere with any aspect of their system of segregation. This outraged black leadership, which during this campaign had its first open revolt against the Republican Party, which was, after all, the party of Lincoln. And there began to be the forming of alliances between black groups and white Catholic and other ethnic groups in the North, which was the beginning of the process that took about 10 years of the black community moving from the Republican side of things to the Democratic Party side of things. But Hoover's national reputation and the booming economy, combined with splits within the Democratic Party over religion and prohibition, guaranteed him a landslide victory with 58% of the vote. He was considered, people thought that he would be one of the greatest presidents that this country had ever had, that his experience in business made him an excellent person to guide the country, to keep prosperity going, that his public service showed how valuable it would be for a businessman to do things that are separated from private enterprise, how the application of solid scientific management principles really did work. Of course, we know that he had the misfortune of being president when the stock market crash happened in the Great Depression. And we'll get into his efforts to address the Depression a little later. When he became president, he said his primary goal as president would be the final elimination of poverty in the United States. He said, "We shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." As president, he introduced the institution of the press conference. Presidents had previously never spoken directly to the press. He asked reporters to directly quote him. He gave them handouts with the statements ahead of time. And in his one term, he had more press conferences than any president succeeding him. So he was very media savvy. But of course, there's a limitation to what media savvy will do if you're dealing with a situation such as the Great Depression that nobody knew exactly what to deal with. But I don't want to get too far ahead, and we won't go into the Great Depression. So I want to switch to something that's very different from politics, which is the most intimate aspects of our lives. And I'm going to start this by showing you some video clips. This is from an oral history project that was done here on the World War II Homefront experience. And I want to show you clips from 4 interviews. The first 3 are with 3 women who will be talking about family life, essentially, aspects of family life. These are very nice people. Their stories are interesting. It's very enjoyable. The 4th clip is with Reverend Ross Heidi, who's a Lutheran minister, who, when he graduated from seminary, was assigned to run an interfaith mission in the Richmond War Workers Housing. And he talks about what happened when he discovered that one of his neighbors, a teenage daughter, had been made pregnant by her father. So in the last story, I think it's important because nowadays there would be no question that the police would be brought in. The state would make sure that the whole situation was taken care of. But even still in the 1940s, family life was considered something personal, private. You don't get involved unless you absolutely have to. So the solution here was simply to evict the family, to remove the embarrassment. This is something that could not happen. It's a story that could not happen today, I presume. Maybe I'm naive on that. And I think it underscores the still developing sense of a confusion about what is the proper role of government and in things. Now, for the first 3 women, these are stories of women marrying very young for apparently frivolous reasons. We'll go back and look at that a little bit closer. I mean, maybe they weren't so frivolous after all, but it's representative of a major trend that occurred in the first half of the 20th century. In the 19th century, generally speaking, the average age, or it's the median age, for first marriage for a woman in the United States was 26, and for a man was 28. Not so different from today. And essentially, this was an aspect of marriage being a business relationship as well as a personal relationship. And so you got married when you were ready to, when the husband-to-be, was clearly ready through his job or a set of skills or property to be able to support a family. Through the first half of the 20th century, the age of first marriage declines dramatically. So that by 1952, which is the nadir point, if we want to use that language, at any rate, the median age has dropped to 17 for women and 19 for men. Now, if you want to I'll give you something that you want to understand your grandparents, or at least your grandparents' generation. You need to think that of the people in this room, half of you would already be parents, in addition to being married. Half of you, literally 1 out of 2 of you, would already be a mother or a father, and many of you would already have 2 children. So if you're going to understand your grandparents or their generation, you have to start with that as the most basic fact of their life. And if you remember, as a typical sort of student, maybe for a male student in particular, he asks the second woman, "Did you feel free when you got a job?" And her response is a little puzzled at first and said, "Free? No, of course not. I had a child." So it's a different world then. But why did the marriage rate decline so rapidly, so quickly, and so low? Well, presumably it's an indicator of the economic boom. That the economic side of marriage motivations, are you ready to get married, was becoming easier and easier for people. Particularly in the 1920s, there's a tremendous labor shortage in the United States, which meant that wages went way up. In part, this was due to the shutting down of immigration from Europe, but in part it was also due to the tremendous investments in industry that were taking place, in the need for more employees, and as well as the expansion of consumer businesses. So there was the capacity to get married seemed to be easier and easier. If you're supposed to get married when you can take care of yourself, it became easier to do so younger. But there's also another reason, which I think is hinted at in the three interviews. Marriage was a way of escaping parental authority and establishing your own life. This was particularly so for women, who, even if they were working, were generally supposed to stay at home with their parents and thus remain under the supervision and remain obedient, as the third woman said. She says, "I wanted to be obedient." But she also wanted to have her own life. All three of these women wanted to have their own life, and the path of least resistance for them to have their own life was to get married. Which might seem contradictory, because within a few months you're pregnant, and a few months after that you have a baby. And then you're no longer free because you have this responsibility. And additionally, men, all